Imagine waking up tomorrow in feudal Japan, 1600. You stretch, yawn, and step outside your wooden house. Within the next 60 seconds, you would likely be dead. Not from war, not from disease, but for something as simple as looking a samurai in the eye. But tonight, I'm going to tell you about two people who found a way to survive in this impossible world. A samurai who refused to die when honor demanded it, and a servant girl who learned to control lords and ladies without them ever knowing she existed. So settle in, dim the lights, and discover how the powerless became powerful in a land where your birth determined everything, including whether you lived to see tomorrow. Welcome to another journey through history's forgotten corners where beauty hides brutal truths. Tonight, we step into the haunting quiet of feudal Japan, a land of cherry blossoms, sharpened steel, and social rules so strict they could crush the soul. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Adjust your pillow, dim the lights, and let the sound of history lull you into rest. Because what you're about to hear isn't just history, it's survival. Picture this. You wake up not in your comfortable bed, but on a straw mat in a wooden house that creaks with every breath of wind. Outside, the year is 1600, and you are no longer yourself. You are now a citizen of feudal Japan, where your birth determines everything. Your work, your worth, your very right to exist. The morning air carries the scent of incense from distant temples, but don't let that fool you into thinking this is a peaceful world. This is a society built on a foundation so rigid that stepping out of line, even by accident, could mean death. Not just any death, but a slow ceremonial execution designed to send a message to everyone watching: know your place or lose your life. In feudal Japan, society was divided into 4 distinct classes, each separated by invisible walls that might as well have been made of iron. At the top sat the samurai, the warrior class, draped in silk and steel. Below them, the farmers, honored for feeding the nation but bound to their fields like prisoners. Then came the artisans, skilled with their hands but forever looking up at those above them. And at the bottom, the merchants, despised despite their wealth, considered parasites feeding off the labor of others. But even this hierarchy was a lie of simplicity. Below these 4 recognized classes existed the invisible people, the ETA and the Heinen, the untouchables, those whose very existence was considered pollution. They handled the dead, worked with leather, swept the streets, and lived in shadows. To touch one was to become contaminated. To be born as one was to inherit a curse that no amount of virtue could lift. The system was called Shinokosho, warrior, farmer, artisan, merchant, and it wasn't just social organization. It was cosmic law, divinely ordained, as natural and unchangeable as the rising of the sun, or so everyone was taught to believe. Let me tell you about Kenji, a man who would have been called a samurai, but whose story reveals the suffocating weight of honor in feudal Japan. Kenji was born into a minor samurai family in a small domain near Kyoto, in the shadow of mountains that had watched over Japan for thousands of years. His father, Nobunaga, named optimistically after the great unifier, served the local daimyo with unwavering loyalty, never questioning orders, never doubting the righteousness of their cause. The Tanaka family had served their lord for 7 generations. Their modest home, with its sliding paper doors and carefully tended garden, sat within the samurai quarter of the castle town. Here, appearances mattered more than truth, form more than substance. Every morning, Kenji would kneel before his family's ancestral shrine, lighting incense for the spirits of warriors who had died gloriously in service to their masters. Kenji was raised to be perfect. He learned to read Chinese characters by the age of 5, copying out passages from Confucian classics until his fingers bled from gripping the brush. He studied poetry, not for beauty, but because a samurai was expected to compose death poems before committing seppuku. He learned tea ceremony, calligraphy, and the complex etiquette that governed every interaction between social classes. But it was the way of the sword that truly defined his education. From dawn until dusk, he practiced with wooden swords until his hands were thick with calluses. He learned the 17 basic cuts, the 8 defensive positions, the subtle differences between fighting with katana and wakizashi. His instructor, an aging ronin whose own master had died in the wars of unification, taught him that the sword was not just a weapon, but the soul of the samurai. "The sword is your honor made manifest," the old teacher would say, watching Kenji practice his forms in the early morning mist. "Lose your sword, and you lose yourself. Dishonor your sword, and you dishonor your ancestors back to the beginning of time." By the age of 20, Kenji was everything a samurai should be: disciplined, literate, and deadly. He could compose a poem while planning a battle strategy, write a letter in elegant calligraphy with the same hand that could cut down 3 men in a single flowing motion. He had internalized every rule, every expectation, every burden of his class. But Kenji carried a secret that would have shattered his family's reputation if discovered. Deep in his heart, beneath the layers of training and conditioning, lived a question that he dared not speak aloud. Why? Why should birth determine worth? Why should some people live in luxury while others starved? Why should the accident of being born into one family rather than another give him the right to kill with impunity? These questions whispered to him during the quiet moments of sword practice, in the spaces between the formal rituals that structured his days. He tried to silence them with more training, more study, more perfect performance of his role. But the questions only grew stronger. The crisis that would define Kenji's life began with something seemingly trivial: a diplomatic mission to a neighboring domain to discuss boundary disputes between rice fields. Such missions were routine, opportunities for young samurai to practice the complex etiquette of interdomain relations, while their elders handled the real negotiations. Kenji's role was purely ceremonial: to carry his lord's sword, to bow at the appropriate moments, to demonstrate through his perfect behavior that his domain bred warriors worthy of respect. He had performed similar duties dozens of times before, always flawlessly, but on this day, something went wrong. As the formal presentations began, Kenji noticed a small commotion near the back of the room. A servant, an elderly man carrying tea, had stumbled slightly. The tray wobbled but didn't fall. No harm was done, no disrespect intended. But the host lord's chief retainer, a man known for his strict interpretation of protocol, stepped forward to berate the servant. What started as correction escalated quickly into humiliation. The servant, perhaps 60 years old with hands gnarled from a lifetime of service, was forced to prostrate himself completely while the retainer listed his failures in excruciating detail. Kenji watched this scene unfold while maintaining his perfectly composed expression. This was not unusual. Servants were regularly disciplined for minor infractions. It was part of the natural order, the necessary maintenance of hierarchy that kept society functioning. But something about the old man's face, the resignation, the complete absence of hope, broke something loose in Kenji's carefully controlled mind. In that moment, he saw not a servant being righteously corrected, but a human being humiliated for the crime of aging hands that could no longer hold a tray perfectly steady. The thought was treasonous. To see a servant as a human being equal in worth to a samurai was to reject the fundamental principles on which their entire world was built. But once the thought was there, Kenji couldn't unknow it. And then he made his mistake. Without thinking, without calculating the consequences, Kenji spoke. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "the honored gentleman has served long enough to deserve rest rather than reproach." The silence that followed was like the moment before an earthquake. Every person in the room understood immediately that something terrible had just happened. A junior samurai had contradicted a senior retainer. Worse, he had done so in defense of a servant, suggesting that the natural order of things might be questioned. The host lord's face went white, then red, then settled into a mask of cold fury. Kenji's own lord looked as if he had been struck by lightning. The diplomatic mission was over before it had properly begun. Kenji's breach of protocol wasn't just embarrassing. It was a spiritual failure that contaminated everyone around him. He had violated the fundamental principle that each person should know their place and keep to it. By speaking out of turn, by defending a social inferior, by implying that the natural order might be unjust, he had attacked the very foundations of their world. The journey home was conducted in absolute silence. Kenji rode behind his lord, watching the rigid line of his master's back, knowing that with a few words he had destroyed not only his own future, but brought shame upon his family and his domain. When they reached home, the reckoning was swift. Kenji was summoned to his lord's presence, where he knelt in formal seiza position for 3 hours, while his master consulted with advisors about the appropriate response to such an unprecedented breach of protocol. Finally, his lord spoke. "Tanaka Kenji," he said, using the formal address that meant their personal relationship was ended. "You have brought dishonor upon your family, your domain, and your ancestors. The way forward is clear." In feudal Japan, the solution to dishonor was seppuku, ritual suicide. The ceremony would restore his family's reputation through the purity of his death. His lord would serve as his kaishakunin, the second who would complete the ritual with a merciful strike to the neck after Kenji had opened his own abdomen with his wakizashi. It was a beautiful death, really. Clean, meaningful, redemptive. Kenji would kneel in white robes at dawn, compose a final poem, and die as a samurai should die, by his own hand, for his own honor, at his own choosing. But as Kenji prepared for the ceremony, spending the night in meditation and preparation, those forbidden questions that had whispered to him for years became a roar. Why should he die for showing compassion? Why was defending human dignity treated as a crime? Why was a system that demanded death for kindness considered natural and just? The morning of his planned seppuku, Kenji knelt in the formal position, his wakizashi laid before him on a white cloth. His lord waited behind him, katana ready. His family watched from the sides, their faces masks of resigned honor. Everything was prepared for a perfect death. But when the moment came to take up his blade, Kenji's hands would not move. It wasn't fear of pain that stopped him. Samurai were trained from childhood to accept death as preferable to dishonor. It wasn't attachment to life. He had been prepared to die for his lord since boyhood. What stopped him was a sudden, crystalline understanding that this entire ritual was built on a lie. His dishonor consisted of treating an old man with compassion. His crime was recognizing the humanity of someone deemed inferior by an artificial system of rank. The system demanded his death not because he had done something wrong, but because he had done something right in a world that called righteousness rebellion. "I cannot," he whispered, and those 2 words shattered his world like glass. The silence that followed was unlike anything any of them had experienced. In feudal Japan, refusing seppuku was literally unthinkable. It was a rejection of everything that gave their lives meaning, purpose, structure. If a samurai could simply choose to live with dishonor, then what separated them from farmers, from merchants, from the despised ETA who handled dead bodies? His lord's face went through a series of transformations. Shock, rage, disgust, and finally something that might have been fear. "You are no longer samurai," he whispered, and those words carried the weight of a curse. "You are no longer human." In that moment, Kenji became something that had no name in their language, a living contradiction, a samurai who had chosen shame over death, a man who existed outside the categories that made sense of their world. His family disowned him that very hour. His name was struck from their records, his belongings burned, his very existence denied. His former friends turned away when they saw him in the street. Even merchants, who occupied the lowest recognized rank in society, refused to do business with him. But something unexpected happened in Kenji's exile from the human community. As he wandered the roads between villages, sleeping in forests and begging for scraps, he encountered people who lived outside the official social structure, the ETA and Heinen, the untouchables who were considered so polluted that their very presence contaminated others. These invisible people, who handled corpses and animal skins and human waste, didn't turn away from him. They understood what it meant to be rejected by a system that claimed to represent divine order. They knew the weight of carrying shame that belonged not to individuals, but to the structure itself. An old ETA man named Saburo, whose job was preparing bodies for burial, was the first to speak to Kenji after his exile began. "You cannot stay with us," he said gently. "If the authorities discover a former samurai among the untouchables, they will assume we have contaminated you further. They will burn our settlements and scatter us like leaves." But Saburo's words carried an undertone of something else. Not just practical concern, but curiosity about what had driven a samurai to choose pollution over purity, shame over honor. I have skills, Kenji said quietly. Not with the sword. I am no longer worthy to carry steel. But I can read and write. I can teach arithmetic. I know something of medicine. Saburo's eyes widened. These were precious capabilities, forbidden to his people not by explicit law but by the reality that no one would teach them. The ETA were expected to live and die in ignorance, performing their necessary but despised functions without the intellectual tools that might allow them to imagine different lives. Why would you share such knowledge with us? Saburo asked. Kenji was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who had been forced to examine the foundations of his beliefs and found them hollow. Because, he said slowly, I have learned that honor is not what I was taught. True honor lies not in preserving an unjust system, but in serving human dignity wherever you find it. And so began Kenji's transformation from samurai to teacher, from guardian of the social order to its quiet saboteur. In the weeks that followed, he would meet secretly with small groups of ETA and Heinen, sharing knowledge that had been the exclusive property of the upper classes. The lessons had to be conducted in absolute secrecy, in abandoned buildings and forest clearings, always with lookouts posted to warn of approaching officials. Kenji taught them to read by scratching characters in dirt, then smoothing them away before anyone could discover evidence of the forbidden education. He showed them mathematical concepts that could help them manage their small trades more efficiently. He shared basic medical knowledge that could save lives in communities that had no access to official physicians. Most importantly, he taught them to think, to question, to analyze, to imagine. This was perhaps the most radical act possible in feudal Japan, the democratization of knowledge. By teaching the untouchables to think critically, Kenji was undermining the very foundations of the system that had created him. But his greatest student would prove to be someone unexpected. A young ETA woman named Mickey, whose intelligence blazed like a hidden fire waiting for fuel. Mickey had been born into the leatherworking caste, her fate seemingly sealed from birth by the pollution of working with dead animals. But she possessed a mind that could grasp complex concepts intuitively, and under Kenji's careful guidance, she began to develop ideas that would have impressed scholars at the imperial court. More dangerous still, she began to develop a vision of what Japanese society could become if it were organized around justice rather than birth, merit rather than inherited status, human dignity rather than cosmic hierarchy. Why? She asked Kenji during one of their clandestine lessons. Do they say we are polluted? We handle death, but death comes to everyone, samurai and farmer alike. We work with animal hides, but samurai wear leather armor. We do the work that must be done, but they call us impure for doing it. Her questions cut straight to the heart of the system's contradictions. The ETA were considered polluted for handling death, but death was universal. They were despised for working with leather, but leather was essential for warfare and agriculture. They were called impure for performing necessary functions that no one else would do. The pollution, Kenji realized as he tried to answer her questions, is not in the work itself. It is in the need to have someone to despise, someone to push down so that others can feel elevated. Under different circumstances, Mickey might have become a philosopher or political theorist. In feudal Japan, such thoughts made her a threat to the cosmic order itself. But in Kenji's secret school, her ideas found fertile ground among people who had nothing to lose by imagining a different world. As autumn deepened into winter, Kenji's informal network of students had grown to include not just ETA and Heinen, but a few farmers, some craftsmen, and even the occasional merchant's child whose parents were willing to risk their social position for the gift of real education. They developed their own signals and codes, ways of recognizing each other and communicating without words. A particular way of arranging flowers in a window might indicate that a lesson was planned. A specific pattern of stones by a roadside could warn of surveillance. The network was growing, but so was the danger. Education was power, and power in the hands of the powerless was revolution. It was only a matter of time before the authorities noticed the subtle changes in behavior among the lowest classes. The way certain ETA carried themselves with new confidence, the questions that farmers' children had begun asking, the sudden appearance of literacy in communities that had been illiterate for generations. But before we follow that inevitable discovery to its conclusion, let me introduce you to another character whose story reveals a different aspect of power in feudal Japan, the hidden influence that could be wielded by those who were officially invisible. Yuki had been born into the servant class in the same castle town where Kenji had grown up, but their paths had never crossed in the rigid social geography of their youth. While Kenji learned sword forms and Chinese poetry in the samurai quarter, Yuki learned different lessons in the spaces between other people's lives. Her mother, a woman named Hana, cleaned the homes of low-ranking samurai families. From her earliest memories, Yuki accompanied her mother on these daily rounds, learning to move through houses like a ghost, present but invisible, necessary but unnoticed. Yuki learned early that survival meant more than just avoiding offense. It meant understanding the complex web of relationships, fears, and desires that motivated the people she served. While her mother focused on the physical work of cleaning, Yuki watched and listened. She noticed that Lord Matsuda's wife counted and recounted the household money when she thought no one was watching, suggesting financial worries that contradicted the family's public displays of wealth. She observed that the young samurai Ichiro practiced his sword forms with unusual intensity, but always favored his left side, hiding an injury that could end his military career if discovered. Most importantly, she learned to read the subtle signs of political tension that rippled through the samurai class like tremors before an earthquake. Conversations that stopped when servants entered the room, unexpected visitors who arrived after dark, the way certain names were mentioned in whispers or not at all. By the time she reached her teens, Yuki had developed what we might now call emotional intelligence to an extraordinary degree. She could predict conflicts before they erupted, identify alliances before they were announced, and sense the hidden currents of ambition and fear that drove political decisions. But unlike Kenji, whose crisis came from a single moment of moral clarity, Yuki's transformation was gradual, almost unconscious. She began to realize that information was power, and that power could be exercised even by those who officially had none. Her first intervention was small, almost accidental. While cleaning the study of a samurai administrator, she overheard plans for a surprise inspection of merchant warehouses, not to ensure quality or prevent hoarding, but to provide an excuse for confiscating goods that could be sold for the personal profit of the officials involved. Yuki knew the merchants who would be targeted. She had cleaned their homes, watched their children grow up, seen how hard they worked despite being despised by the very system they served. The planned theft would ruin families, destroy lives built over generations of careful labor. Instead of reporting the plan directly, which would have required her to break her position in the social order and probably resulted in her death, she found another way. She left an anonymous letter in the path of the lead merchant, written in the formal characters that educated men expected from each other. The letter warned of the planned inspection and suggested that certain goods might be temporarily moved to avoid misunderstandings. The merchants heeded the warning. The corrupt officials found empty warehouses, and Yuki learned that she could change the course of events without anyone knowing she existed. The realization was intoxicating and terrifying. For the first time in her life, she had exercised real power. Not over her own circumstances, which remained as constrained as ever, but over the lives of others. She had prevented injustice, protected the innocent, punished the corrupt. But she had also discovered something dangerous: the addictive nature of hidden influence, the seductive appeal of being the invisible hand that guided visible events. Over the months that followed, Yuki's interventions became more sophisticated. She developed a network of information sources among the servant class, learning to piece together larger patterns from fragments of overheard conversation. She created systems for passing warnings and advice without revealing her role as coordinator. Most importantly, she began to understand that individual acts of protection or sabotage, while satisfying, were less effective than longer-term strategies that addressed systemic problems. The feudal system created endless opportunities for corruption and abuse because it concentrated power in the hands of people who faced no accountability for their actions. But it also created opportunities for hidden resistance because its very rigidity made it vulnerable to small disruptions applied at critical points. Yuki began to see herself as a kind of shadow administrator, working to make the system function more justly, even while remaining officially powerless within it. It was a form of resistance that required tremendous patience and self-discipline, but it was also more sustainable than open rebellion. As winter settled over the domain, Both Kenji and Yuki were pursuing their separate forms of resistance to the rigid hierarchies that defined their world. Neither knew of the other's work, but their efforts were part of the same larger transformation. The emergence of people willing to reject the roles assigned to them by an unjust system. The rigid social structure of feudal Japan had been designed to prevent exactly this kind of development. The elaborate rules of hierarchy, the severe punishments for stepping out of place, the spiritual justifications for inequality, all of these were intended to ensure that people accepted their assigned positions without question. But systems of oppression, no matter how carefully designed, contain within themselves the seeds of their own transformation. By creating categories of people who were officially powerless, feudal Japan also created communities with nothing to lose by imagining alternatives. By demanding perfect obedience from everyone, it ensured that any act of conscience would appear as rebellion. And by claiming that its arrangements reflected divine will, it made any evidence of injustice into a theological crisis that could shake the foundations of belief. As the snow began to fall heavier, covering the domain in white silence, the quiet revolutions begun by Kenji and Yuki were spreading in ways that neither could have anticipated. The knowledge that Kenji shared with his hidden students was being passed along to others. The protection that Yuki provided to merchants and farmers was creating networks of obligation and gratitude that could be called upon for larger purposes. Neither the teacher nor the shadow strategist knew it yet, but their separate efforts were about to intersect in ways that would challenge not just their personal understanding of power and resistance, but the stability of the entire domain. The feudal system that had seemed as permanent as the mountains was beginning to crack like ice in spring, and once such cracks appear, they have a tendency to spread until the entire structure collapses, making way for something new to grow in its place. But for now, there was only the gentle fall of snow, the soft sound of wind through pine branches, and the knowledge that transformation, however dangerous and uncertain, had already begun in the hidden spaces between official reality and human truth. Sleep well, knowing that the quiet courage of individuals like Kenji and Yuki has echoed through history, creating the freedoms you enjoy in your own time. Their stories remind us that every system of oppression, no matter how total it appears, depends ultimately on the cooperation of the oppressed. And when that cooperation is withdrawn, quietly, carefully, courageously, even the most rigid hierarchies begin to tremble like cherry blossoms in the wind. Tomorrow will bring new challenges for our characters, new dangers and opportunities as their hidden revolutions encounter the full power of the system they are challenging. But tonight, let their example of quiet resistance carry you gently into sleep, where dreams of justice and transformation can flourish without fear. The snow continues to fall, covering the world in pristine white that makes all things appear possible again. The morning sun filtered through paper screens, casting gentle shadows across tatami mats. But don't let this peaceful image deceive you. In feudal Japan, even the most beautiful mornings carried the potential for sudden, terrible consequences. Spring was approaching, and with it came the annual tax assessments that would determine how much rice each farming family would surrender to their lord. The calculations were supposed to be based on objective measures of land productivity and weather conditions, but everyone understood that they were really exercises in extracting the maximum possible tribute while leaving just enough for the farmers to survive until the next harvest. If you had awakened as a common citizen in this world, your first thoughts wouldn't be about the day's possibilities, but about its dangers. Every interaction, every word, every gesture had to be calculated to avoid giving offense to someone whose social position gave them the power to destroy you. Let's follow an ordinary day in the life of Hiroshi, the farmer whose family had worked the same rice fields for 7 generations. Hiroshi's day began before dawn, not by choice, but by necessity. The rice demanded attention, and the rice belonged to the local daimyo, even though Hiroshi's family had planted, tended, and harvested it with their own bleeding hands. But before Hiroshi could even reach his fields, he had to navigate a maze of social protocols that would seem absurd to a modern person, but were matters of life and death in feudal Japan. Walking to his fields through the pre-dawn mist, Hiroshi encountered Tanaka-san, the low-ranking samurai who served as an administrator for the domain. We met him in our first story, the thoughtful man who had chosen mercy over duty when he pretended not to hear Hiroshi's small sound of pain. But this morning was different. This morning, Tanaka-san was not alone. He was accompanied by Watanabe-san, a senior retainer from the provincial capital, a man known throughout the domain for his strict interpretation of protocol and his unwillingness to overlook even the smallest infractions. Protocol demanded that Hiroshi immediately drop to his hands and knees, bow until his forehead touched the dirt road, and remain in that position until given permission to rise. This wasn't mere politeness. It was recognition of the fundamental difference in their nature. Hiroshi was human, but these men were something more, members of the warrior class whose very existence was considered sacred. But on this particular morning, several problems converged to create a crisis that would reveal the impossible position that everyone in feudal Japan occupied. First, Hiroshi's elderly back, bent from decades of labor, had grown worse during the winter. The deep bow that had once been merely uncomfortable was now genuinely painful, requiring him to suppress sounds of distress that might be interpreted as complaint. Second, the road was muddy from recent rains, and the precise position required for proper submission would mean kneeling in cold water that would soak through his thin cotton clothing and chill him for the rest of the day. Third, and most dangerously, he was carrying a small bundle of early vegetables, the first harvest of spring onions that his wife had asked him to take to market. To perform the required bow, he would need to set the bundle down in the mud, potentially ruining the food that represented a significant portion of their meager income. Any one of these problems would have been manageable. Together, they created an impossible situation. Hiroshi could not bow properly without damaging his health and his family's economic survival. But he could not fail to bow without committing a breach of protocol that could result in immediate death. As he approached the two samurai, Hiroshi's mind raced through his limited options. He could try to explain his situation, but speaking to samurai without permission was itself a serious offense. He could attempt a modified bow that might preserve his vegetables and his dignity, but any deviation from proper form would likely be interpreted as disrespect. Or he could perform the full, proper bow and accept the consequences: ruined food, painful injury, and the message to his family that their survival mattered less than the comfort of their social superiors. Hiroshi chose the full bow, kneeling in the cold mud, placing his forehead against the ground, setting his precious vegetables in the water where they would absorb dirt and grime that would make them unsellable. But as he knelt there, waiting for permission to rise, something unprecedented happened. Tanaka-san, remembering his previous moment of mercy toward this same farmer, made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Rise, good farmer," he said quickly before Watanabe-san could speak. "Your dedication to proper respect is noted and appreciated." The words were carefully chosen to suggest that Hiroshi's bow had been exemplary rather than problematic, forestalling any criticism from the senior retainer. But Watanabe-san was not so easily deceived. "The bow seemed rather rushed," he observed coldly. "Perhaps the farmer's enthusiasm for his work in the fields exceeds his commitment to proper etiquette." The comment was a trap. If Tanaka-san agreed, he would be condemning Hiroshi to punishment for insufficient respect. If he disagreed, he would be contradicting a superior, which was itself a breach of hierarchy. "I observed careful attention to form," Tanaka-san replied carefully. "Sometimes enthusiasm for service can appear as haste, but the substance of respect was clearly present." Watanabe-san studied both men with the cold attention of a hawk watching mice. He understood exactly what was happening. A junior samurai was protecting a farmer from consequences that would normally be automatic. The protection itself was a violation of natural order. "Perhaps," Watanabe-san said slowly, "both the farmer and his protector would benefit from a reminder about the importance of maintaining proper relationships between the classes." The threat was unmistakable. Both Hiroshi and Tanaka-san now faced potential punishment, the farmer for inadequate respect and the samurai for failing to enforce proper discipline. But before either man could respond, something unexpected happened. A voice called out from the road behind them, "Honored gentlemen, forgive the interruption." They turned to see a figure approaching through the morning mist, a woman dressed in the simple robes of a traveling nun, her head shaved, her manner humble, but not servile. This was Yuki, though they did not know her name or her true purpose. Yuki had been watching the confrontation unfold from a distance, recognizing the danger to both Hiroshi and Tanaka-san. Her network of information sources had warned her about Watanabe-san's visit, and his reputation for using minor infractions to demonstrate his authority and advance his own position within the domain's hierarchy. She had also come to understand, through careful observation and analysis, that Tanaka-san was a potential ally, a samurai whose natural compassion made him vulnerable to the very system he was supposed to enforce. Such men could be protected and influenced, but only if their moments of mercy were skillfully concealed from those who would punish them for showing humanity. "I am Sister Moonlight," Yuki said, using one of several identities she had developed for different purposes. "I travel between domains offering prayers for the prosperity of the harvest and the wisdom of the administrators who guide it." The introduction was carefully crafted to position her as religiously harmless while subtly flattering the samurai's sense of importance. As a nun, she could speak to men without impropriety. As a traveler, she could claim ignorance of local customs. As someone offering prayers for administrators, she could intervene in administrative matters without seeming to overstep her role. "I could not help but notice," she continued, "the exemplary respect shown by this farmer and the wise guidance provided by these honorable administrators. Such scenes remind me why the kami bless domains where proper order is maintained through compassionate authority." The words were a masterpiece of diplomatic misdirection. By praising both the farmer's respect and the administrator's guidance, she made it impossible for Watanabe-san to criticize either without seeming to reject divine approval. By mentioning the kami, the Shinto spirits who were supposed to bless righteous rule, she elevated the entire interaction to a spiritual level where harsh punishment would seem inappropriate. Watanabe-san found himself in an unexpected position. He had intended to use this minor incident to demonstrate his authority and perhaps advance his standing by correcting the lax discipline he perceived in this domain. But the nun's intervention had reframed the situation as an example of proper order, rather than a failure requiring correction. To proceed with punishment now would mean rejecting the spiritual validation that the nun had offered, but to accept her interpretation would mean abandoning his planned demonstration of authority. "Indeed," he said finally, "proper order maintained through wise guidance is the foundation of prosperity. Perhaps we should continue our inspection of the fields to ensure that such exemplary relationships are maintained throughout the domain." It was a graceful retreat disguised as administrative diligence. Watanabe-san would continue his inspection, but the immediate crisis had passed. Hiroshi was free to rise, retrieve his muddy vegetables, and continue to his fields. Tanaka-san had been protected from the consequences of his compassion, and Yuki had demonstrated, to herself and to careful observers, that even the most rigid hierarchies could be influenced by someone who understood how to speak their language of honor, order, and spiritual righteousness. As the samurai continued down the road and Hiroshi hurried toward his fields, Yuki reflected on what she had accomplished and what it revealed about the nature of power in feudal Japan. Official power, the power to command, to punish, to kill, was indeed concentrated in the hands of the samurai class. But that power depended on the cooperation of everyone else, and that cooperation could be influenced by those who understood the system's weaknesses and contradictions. The feudal hierarchy claimed to represent divine order, but it was maintained by human decisions made by individuals who had their own fears, ambitions, and vulnerabilities. Those individuals could be influenced, guided, and sometimes even controlled by someone who understood their psychology and spoke to their deepest needs for validation and spiritual security. Yuki had learned to wield what we might now call soft power, influence exercised through culture, symbol, and psychological understanding rather than direct force. It was a form of power particularly suited to someone who was officially powerless, because it operated below the level of conscious awareness and thus avoided triggering the defensive responses that direct challenges would provoke. But soft power was also limited. It could protect individuals like Hiroshi and Tanaka-san from immediate consequences, but it could not address the systemic injustices that created such situations in the first place. For that, something more radical would be required. As Yuki walked away from the scene, disappearing back into the morning mist, her thoughts turned to rumors she had been hearing about a disgraced samurai who was teaching forbidden knowledge to the untouchable castes. The rumors were vague and fragmentary, but they suggested the emergence of someone whose resistance to the system was more direct and potentially more transformative than her own. She decided that this mysterious teacher was worth investigating. Meanwhile, Several miles away, in an abandoned shrine hidden deep in the forest, Kenji was conducting one of his secret lessons with a group that had grown far beyond his original handful of ETA students. The student body now included Miki, the brilliant young woman whose questions had helped him understand the deeper contradictions of the feudal system. But it also included Jiro, Hiroshi's son, who had somehow learned about the secret school and convinced his father to let him attend, despite the enormous risks. There was also old grandmother Toshi, an ETA woman whose job was preparing bodies for burial, but who had revealed herself to be a repository of oral traditions and folk wisdom that challenged official accounts of history. She knew stories about times before the rigid class system, about women who had ruled domains, about peasant uprisings that had succeeded in creating brief periods of more just governance. The group included several craftsmen who had grown tired of being despised despite their essential skills, a few merchants' children whose parents had decided that education was worth the risk of discovery, and even a young samurai named Masa who had become disillusioned with his class after witnessing too many acts of casual cruelty. This diversity was both the strength and the vulnerability of Kenji's school. The variety of perspectives enriched their discussions and helped them develop more sophisticated analyses of their society's problems. But it also made them much more visible to authorities who were trained to notice unusual patterns of association between social classes. Today's lesson focused on a question that Miki had raised during their previous meeting. If the social hierarchy was truly natural and divinely ordained, why did it require such constant enforcement through violence and intimidation? Think about rice, Kenji said, using the Socratic method he had learned from his own classical education. Rice grows because its nature is to grow. We plant it, water it, and care for it, but we do not need to threaten it with death to make it follow its nature. Jiro, the farmer's son, understood immediately. The rice wants to grow, but people do not naturally want to submit to oppression. That's why the system needs armies and executioners? Exactly, said Miki. If hierarchy were natural, children would be born already knowing their place and accepting it gladly. Instead, they have to be trained through punishment and fear to suppress their natural instincts for equality and justice. Old grandmother Toshi nodded slowly. In the stories my grandmother told me, there were times when people chose their leaders based on wisdom and virtue, not birth. Those leaders served the people instead of the people serving them. The current system is not old. It was imposed by those who benefited from it. Young Masa, the disillusioned samurai, shifted uncomfortably. These ideas challenged everything he had been taught about honor, duty, and the natural order of things. But he could not deny what he had observed, that the system he was supposed to defend seemed to create more suffering than happiness, more cruelty than virtue. But if the system is unnatural, he asked hesitantly, why has it lasted so long? Why don't people simply refuse to participate? The question revealed the psychological sophistication of the feudal system's methods of control. It was not enough to simply oppress people physically. They had to be convinced that their oppression was deserved, natural, even spiritually necessary. Because, Kenji explained, the system teaches people to oppress themselves. It convinces them that their suffering is their own fault, that questioning the order of things is selfish and dangerous, that accepting injustice is a form of virtue. And because, added Yuki's voice from the entrance to the shrine, those who benefit from the system control not just armies and laws, but stories and symbols and the very language we use to think about our world. Everyone turned in surprise. They had been discovered by a stranger, a woman dressed as a traveling nun, who had somehow found their secret meeting place despite all their precautions. The moment stretched like a drawn bowstring. Discovery by the authorities would mean death for everyone present. Not just Kenji, who had already been cast out from samurai society, but the farmers, craftsmen, and even young Masa, whose family name would be destroyed along with his life. But something in the woman's manner suggested that she was not an official spy. She entered the shrine with respect, bowing to the assembled group as if their gathering were a legitimate philosophical discussion rather than a treasonous violation of social order. I am called Sister Moonlight, she said, using the same false identity she had employed that morning to protect Hiroshi and Tanaka-san. I have been searching for people who ask the right questions. It seems I have found them. Kenji studied her carefully. Something about her presence seemed familiar, though he was certain they had never met. There was a quality of controlled intelligence in her movements, a way of observing that reminded him of his own methods of reading people and situations. "And what questions do you think we are asking?" he replied cautiously. "The question of whether the world must be as it is," Yuki answered. "The question of whether birth determines worth, whether hierarchy serves justice, whether the suffering of many is required for the comfort of few." The accuracy of her assessment was unsettling. She had somehow identified not just their activities, but their fundamental motivations. This suggested either extensive surveillance or remarkable analytical capability. Mickey, whose intelligence had made her bold in ways that would have been impossible for someone with more to lose, spoke up directly. "How did you find us? And why should we trust you?" Yuki smiled at the young woman's directness. Here was someone who understood that pleasantries were luxuries that people in their position could not afford. "I found you because I have been watching for signs of organized questioning, and your group has created patterns that careful observation can detect. As for trust, you shouldn't. Trust is earned through demonstrated commitment to shared goals." She paused, considering how much to reveal about her own activities. "I can tell you this. I have spent years working to protect people like yourselves from the consequences of showing intelligence and conscience. But protection is not transformation. I have begun to wonder whether more direct action might be necessary." The statement was both an offer and a test. If the group was serious about creating change rather than just discussing it, they would need to move beyond education to action. But action meant risks that could destroy not just individuals, but entire families and communities. Kenji understood that they had reached a crucial moment. The secret school had been his way of preserving something valuable: human dignity, critical thinking, hope for justice, within a system designed to destroy such things. But preservation was not the same as transformation. "What kind of action are you thinking about?" he asked carefully. "The kind that uses the system's own rules and symbols against itself," Yuki replied. "The kind that exposes the contradictions between what the system claims to be and what it actually does. The kind that gives people permission to trust their own moral instincts, instead of the authorities who tell them those instincts are wrong." She looked around the group, making eye contact with each person. "You have been teaching people to think. I propose that we teach them to act." The discussion that followed would extend deep into the night, as the group wrestled with questions that had no clear answers. How could they challenge an unjust system without becoming unjust themselves? How could they protect their families while working for transformation that might not come in their lifetimes? How could they build something better without first destroying what existed? Young Mesa, the samurai, struggled especially with these questions. Everything he had been taught told him that loyalty to his lord was the highest virtue, that maintaining order was more important than seeking justice, that individual conscience should be subordinated to collective stability. But his experiences with Kenji's group had shown him that the order he was supposed to maintain was built on lies, that the stability he was supposed to protect served primarily those who already had power, that the loyalty he was supposed to demonstrate often required him to participate in or ignore acts of cruelty. "I understand now why my class carries swords," he said finally. "Not because we are naturally brave or honorable, but because the system we defend is so unjust that it can only be maintained through violence and the threat of violence." Old grandmother Toshi nodded approvingly. "When I was young, before the laws became so strict, there were samurai who served the people instead of their own privilege. They protected farmers from bandits, merchants from corrupt officials, communities from natural disasters. Honor meant service, not dominance." "Such samurai still exist," Yuki observed. "But they are trapped within a system that punishes compassion and rewards cruelty. They need permission to follow their better instincts." This insight would prove to be the foundation of the strategy that the group would develop over the following months. Instead of directly attacking the feudal system, they would work to create space within it for people to act according to their natural sense of justice and compassion. They would identify samurai like Tanaka-san, who were struggling with the contradictions between their personal ethics and their official duties, and provide them with ways to exercise mercy without appearing to violate their obligations. They would support merchants and craftsmen who were willing to share their prosperity with those below them in the social hierarchy, helping them develop economic relationships that benefited entire communities rather than just the ruling class. They would connect farmers across different domains, allowing them to share information about crop management, weather patterns, and survival strategies that could reduce their vulnerability to natural disasters and official exploitation. Most importantly, they would work to preserve and spread the stories, songs, and folk wisdom that remembered times when Japanese society had been organized according to different principles, times when cooperation was valued over competition, when leaders were chosen for their virtue rather than their birth, when prosperity was shared rather than hoarded. This cultural work was perhaps the most radical aspect of their activities. The feudal system maintained its power not just through force, but through controlling the stories that people told about themselves and their world. By preserving alternative narratives, the group was creating the intellectual foundation for alternative ways of organizing society. But as their network grew and their activities became more ambitious, they also became more visible to those whose power depended on maintaining the status quo. The first sign of official attention came when Jiro, Hiroshi's son, was questioned by local officials about his unusual literacy. A farmer's child who could read and write was suspicious enough, but Jiro had also been observed asking questions about legal procedures, tax assessment methods, and the historical basis for current land ownership patterns. The questioning was handled carefully. Jiro was not accused of any specific crime, just asked to explain how he had acquired his education and why he was interested in matters that seemed beyond his proper concerns. Jiro, who had been coached by Kenji and Yuki for exactly such a situation, explained that he had learned to read from a traveling monk who had stayed briefly in their village. His questions about legal and administrative matters, he claimed, arose from his desire to better serve his lord by understanding the complexities of domain management. The explanation was plausible enough to avoid immediate punishment, but it also served as a warning. The authorities were becoming aware that something unusual was happening among the lower classes, and they were beginning to investigate. Similar incidents occurred across the domain. A merchant's daughter was noticed reading books that seemed too advanced for her supposed education. An ETA man was observed engaging in mathematical calculations that suggested knowledge of accounting principles. Several farmers were reported to have been overheard discussing political events in neighboring domains with surprising sophistication. None of these incidents was serious enough to warrant severe punishment, but together they formed a pattern that worried the domain's administrators. The social order depended on each class knowing only what was necessary for their assigned functions. When people began acquiring knowledge beyond their station, it suggested a breakdown in the natural hierarchy that could lead to dangerous questioning of authority. Yuki, with her network of informants among the servant class, was among the first to recognize that official attention was focusing on their activities. She began preparing contingency plans for protecting the most vulnerable members of their network if a serious crackdown occurred. But she also recognized an opportunity in the authorities' concern. The very fact that they were worried about literacy and knowledge among the lower classes revealed their understanding that education was indeed power, and that power in the hands of the oppressed was revolutionary. This recognition would lead to the next phase of their resistance strategy. Instead of trying to hide their educational activities, they would work to make education so widespread and so obviously beneficial that the authorities would be reluctant to suppress it entirely. The plan was ambitious and dangerous. It required them to move from secret resistance to something approaching open defiance. But it also offered the possibility of creating changes that could not be easily reversed, transformations that would outlast any individual persecution. As winter deepened and the year moved toward its end, Kenji, Yuki, and their growing network prepared for a campaign that would test not just their courage and intelligence, but their understanding of how societies change and how power really works in the world. They were about to discover that revolution is not just a matter of changing laws or replacing rulers, but of transforming the stories that people tell about what is possible and what is necessary in human relationships. The feudal system that had seemed as permanent as the mountains was about to face its first serious challenge from people who had been officially invisible, officially powerless, officially irrelevant to the course of history. But before that challenge could unfold, they would need to solve a fundamental problem. how to coordinate resistance across a society where communication between social classes was heavily restricted and carefully monitored. The solution they developed would prove to be as elegant as it was subversive, using the very symbols and rituals of the feudal system to carry messages that undermined its authority. But that is a story for another chapter in our long night's journey through the shadows and possibilities of feudal Japan. For now, rest in the knowledge that ordinary people have always found ways to resist extraordinary oppression, that intelligence and courage can overcome systems designed to crush the human spirit, and that the arc of history, however slowly, bends toward justice when people are willing to bend it. The snow continues to fall outside, covering the world in white silence that makes all things seem possible again. In that silence, dreams of transformation can take root and grow, preparing for the spring that always follows winter, no matter how long and cold the darkness may seem. Sleep now, knowing that the struggles of people like Kenji and Yuki echo in every generation, in every society where human dignity confronts systems that deny it. Their courage lives on in every person who chooses justice over safety, truth over comfort, hope over despair. And in your dreams, perhaps you will find the wisdom to recognize the opportunities for transformation that exist in your own time, the chances to bend the arc of history just a little more toward the light. The temple bells are ringing midnight, marking the end of one day and the beginning of another. In feudal Japan, as in every time and place, each new day brings the possibility that ordinary people will do extraordinary things, that the powerless will find power, that the voiceless will find their voice. Tomorrow will bring new challenges for our characters, new tests of their commitment to transformation despite its costs. But tonight, let their example of quiet courage carry you gently into sleep, where the dreams of justice that sustain all resistance can flourish without fear. Rest well, knowing that their story continues in every person who refuses to accept that injustice is inevitable, who insists that the world can be better than it is, who works to make that better world possible for those who will come after. The cherry blossoms will bloom again in spring, as they always have, but the world they bloom in will be shaped by the choices of those who dare to imagine that beauty and justice can flourish together, that hierarchy can serve human dignity rather than destroying it, that the accidents of birth need not determine the possibilities of life. In that hope, find peace. In that vision, find rest. In that promise of transformation, find the sleep that prepares the soul for tomorrow's opportunities to serve the cause of human flourishing. The snow falls softly on the mountain shrine where learning became revolution, where questions became hope, where the impossible began its slow transformation into the inevitable. Sleep and dream of spring. The tea ceremony was one of the few spaces in feudal Japan where the rigid social hierarchy softened, where a kind of spiritual democracy could emerge in the careful choreography of host and guest. But even in this sanctuary of refinement, the underlying tensions of Japanese society pulsed like a hidden heartbeat. Spring had arrived in full bloom, and with it came both beauty and danger. The cherry blossoms that had inspired poets for centuries now seemed to mock the artificial permanence of the social order. Their brief flowering reminded everyone that all things pass away, even systems that claim to be eternal. In a tea house near the castle town of the domain, Yuki knelt with perfect posture, her movements as she prepared the tea flowing like water over stone. To the samurai watching her perform the ceremony, she was invisible in the way that servants were supposed to be invisible. Present, but not really there. Competent, but not truly conscious. But Yuki was watching everything with the intensity of a master strategist planning a campaign. The slight tension in Lord Matsuda's shoulders when he mentioned the neighboring domain. The way Commander Hayashi's hand moved unconsciously toward his sword when discussing the recent rice shortage. The careful pause that Lady Sasaki allowed before responding to questions about her husband's loyalty. These tiny signs, meaningless to most observers, formed a complex map in Yuki's mind. A map of fears, ambitions, secrets, and vulnerabilities that she could read like a master scholar reading classical poetry. Today's gathering was officially about appreciating the spring flowers and discussing poetry. But Yuki understood that the real purpose was to assess the domain's readiness for the political storms that everyone could sense approaching. The Tokugawa shogunate was consolidating power with ruthless efficiency, and smaller domains like this one would soon face impossible choices, submit completely or risk destruction. As she served the tea with practiced grace, Yuki listened to the careful dance of words between the Lord and his advisors. They spoke in layers of meaning, saying one thing while communicating something entirely different. Lord Matsuda praised the shogun's wisdom while subtly probing for information about his guests' true loyalties. Commander Hayashi expressed concern for the domain's security while quietly assessing which of his colleagues might be potential allies or threats. But it was Lady Sasaki whose presence intrigued Yuki most. She was the wife of a minor lord from a neighboring domain, officially here to enjoy the tea ceremony and discuss the latest poetry from the capital. But Yuki had noticed subtle signs that suggested a different purpose. The way Lady Sasaki's eyes lingered on strategic points around the castle town, her carefully casual questions about troop strengths and supply lines, the small silk pouch she kept, hidden in her sleeve, Yuki realized she was watching another woman who had learned to wield power through invisibility, but one who operated on a much higher level of the social hierarchy. The conversation turned to recent disturbances in neighboring domains, reports of unusual behavior among the lower classes, farmers asking questions above their station, merchants forming unauthorized associations, even rumors of ETA and Heinen, who had somehow learned to read and write. Such developments are troubling, Lord Matsuda observed carefully. When people step outside their proper roles, it suggests a breakdown in moral instruction that could spread like a disease. Commander Hayashi nodded gravely. My contacts in other domains report similar patterns. Servants who speak too freely, farmers who seem unusually informed about political matters, craftsmen who ask questions about the historical basis for current arrangements. Lady Sasaki smiled delicately. Perhaps these reports are exaggerated. It is human nature to see conspiracy where there is merely coincidence. A few educated servants, some curious farmers, surely this does not constitute a threat to the natural order. But her words carried an undertone that Yuki recognized. This was not dismissal, but intelligence gathering. Lady Sasaki was probing to see how much the local authorities knew about developments that she clearly understood better than she was pretending. Still, Lord Matsuda replied, it would be wise to investigate such reports thoroughly. The maintenance of proper order requires constant vigilance against the forces of chaos. As the ceremony continued, Yuki found herself analyzing not just the spoken conversation, but the complex web of hidden communications flowing beneath it. Lady Sasaki was clearly more than she appeared to be. The timing of her visit, the sophistication of her questions, the way she deflected attention from the very issues she was most interested in, all suggested that she was part of some larger intelligence operation. More intriguingly, some of her questions seemed designed to assess not just the domain's military capabilities, but the extent of educational activities among the lower classes. She was particularly interested in reports of literacy among people who should not have been able to read, of mathematical knowledge among farmers, of political awareness among artisans. The possibility that someone at Lady Sasaki's level of society was interested in the same phenomena that occupied Yuki's attention suggested something that had never occurred to her, that resistance to the feudal system might be emerging simultaneously at multiple levels of society. As the ceremony concluded and the guests prepared to leave, Lady Sasaki approached Yuki with what appeared to be a simple compliment about the tea preparation. But as she spoke, she discreetly pressed something small and hard into Yuki's palm, a carved ivory token that Yuki immediately recognized as a symbol used by networks of information exchange. Your movements are very graceful, Lady Sasaki said, her voice carrying no particular emphasis. I hope we have the opportunity to observe them again. Yuki bowed deeply, hiding her surprise and excitement. She had been discovered, not by the male authorities whose suspicions she had carefully avoided, but by another woman who had learned to read the same subtle signs that Yuki used in her own work. That night, alone in her small room behind the kitchen, Yuki examined the token by candlelight. Carved into its surface was a message in a code that combined classical Chinese characters with symbols that looked like decorative flourishes but actually conveyed specific information. The message was both an invitation and a test. Lady Sasaki's network knew of Yuki's activities and wanted to recruit her for a much larger game. They were gathering intelligence about the various domains' loyalties, strengths, and weaknesses, preparing for the political upheaval that would determine Japan's future. But joining this network would mean abandoning the careful anonymity that had protected Yuki for so long. It would mean revealing her capabilities to people she didn't know, trusting her life to women whose motivations she couldn't fully understand. More importantly, it would mean choosing sides in a conflict whose ultimate outcome was far from certain. The intelligence network that Lady Sasaki represented was clearly sophisticated and well-connected, but it was also operating at a level of politics where failure could mean not just personal destruction, but the devastation of entire domains. Yuki sat in the darkness, weighing her options with the careful calculation that had kept her alive and effective for so many years. She had spent those years building her individual power base, learning to influence events through careful manipulation of information and psychology. But the political crisis approaching Japan was too large for any individual to navigate alone. The old ways of doing things, including her own methods, might not be sufficient for what was coming. The feudal system was facing challenges from multiple directions. The centralizing power of the Tokugawa, the economic pressures of a changing world, and most dangerously, the emergence of educated resistance among the classes that were supposed to remain ignorant and submissive. As dawn approached, Yuki made her decision. She carved her response into a piece of wood using the same code system, accepting the invitation while requesting more information about the network's goals and methods. She would meet with Lady Sasaki's representatives, but she would also maintain her connections to people like Kenji and his students. She was about to discover that her small domain contained only a tiny piece of a vast puzzle, and that women throughout Japan had been building their own shadow networks for generations, preparing for opportunities that might finally allow them to shape their country's destiny. 3 days later, following instructions encoded in a flower arrangement that appeared in Lady Sasaki's window, Yuki made her way to an abandoned temple complex in the mountains above the domain. The journey required her to travel as a pilgrim, carrying appropriate religious texts, and wearing the humble robes of someone seeking spiritual purification. The temple had been abandoned for decades, officially because of structural damage from an earthquake. But Yuki suspected it had been chosen for this meeting precisely because its isolation made surveillance difficult, while its religious character provided cover for gatherings that might otherwise seem suspicious. As she approached the main hall, Yuki could see other women arriving along different paths, some traveling as pilgrims like herself, others as merchants, still others as servants accompanying their mistresses on religious journeys. But when they gathered in the temple's main hall, removing their various disguises and revealing their true purposes, Yuki found herself in the presence of an assembly unlike anything she could have imagined. There were women from every level of society, samurai wives and daughters whose husbands served various daimyo throughout central Japan, merchants' daughters who had been educated in secret despite their officially inferior status, craftsmen's wives who had learned to read and write by watching their husbands work with written instructions, and even a few women who had somehow acquired learning despite being born into the lowest castes. What united them was not their birth or their official social status, but their intelligence, their determination, and their shared understanding that the world they lived in was not the only world possible. The leader of this gathering was an elderly woman known only as Lady Moon, a name that suggested both the hidden nature of their work and its power to influence events from a distance. Lady Moon had spent decades building the network, recruiting women, establishing communication systems, and preparing for the opportunity that was now approaching. "The old order is dying," Lady Moon began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen through multiple political transformations. "The question is not whether change will come, but what kind of change we can help to create." She outlined the network's analysis of Japan's current situation with a sophistication that rivaled the strategic thinking of the most experienced daimyo. The Tokugawa shogunate was indeed consolidating power, but their success depended on the cooperation of the various domains. Some domains would resist, leading to conflicts that could tear the country apart. Others would submit, but grudgingly, creating long-term instability that could undermine any hope of lasting peace. The network's goal was not to choose sides in these conflicts, but to influence all sides toward arrangements that would create space for women's participation in the new order. This required an extraordinarily sophisticated strategy. They needed to be valuable enough to all the competing factions that none would dare to eliminate them, while also positioning themselves to be indispensable to whatever faction ultimately prevailed. But Lady Moon also revealed something that shocked Yuki. The network already had agents within the Tokugawa administration itself. Women who had managed to become informal advisors to powerful men by demonstrating their analytical capabilities while carefully avoiding any appearance of political ambition. You see, Lady Moon explained, men in power often suffer from a peculiar blindness. They cannot imagine that women might have political thoughts. So when a woman offers strategic advice, they assume she is simply expressing feminine intuition or domestic concern. They accept our intelligence while denying our intelligence. This revelation transformed Yuki's understanding of what was possible. The network wasn't just gathering information and hoping to influence events from the margins. They were already operating at the highest levels of power, hidden in plain sight. One of the younger women, introduced as Lady Crane, described her work as an unofficial advisor to a Tokugawa administrator. He consults me about local conditions, population management, tax policy, even military logistics, she explained. But he would be horrified if anyone suggested that he was taking political advice from a woman. In his mind, I am simply helping him understand domestic concerns that affect his policies. Another woman, called Lady Willow, had established herself as an expert on economic conditions in the rural areas where she traveled as a merchant. Local officials ask my opinion about crop yields, trade patterns, the reliability of different suppliers, she said. They value my knowledge while dismissing my intelligence. The sophistication of their operations was breathtaking. They had developed communication networks that could carry information across hundreds of miles without using any official channels. They had established safe houses and meeting places throughout the country. Most impressively, they had learned to influence policy at the highest levels while remaining officially invisible. But Lady Moon's next words carried a warning that chilled the assembled women. The opportunities we are creating will not last forever. If we succeed in demonstrating our value, we will eventually face demands that we reveal ourselves fully. When that moment comes, we will have to choose between returning to invisibility or openly claiming our place in Japan's political order. And if we choose visibility? Asked one of the younger women. Lady Moon's answer was stark. Then we risk everything. Open political participation by women would violate every principle of Confucian order. We would face not just individual punishment, but systematic persecution, designed to prevent other women from following our example. Some of us would certainly die. Others would face exile, imprisonment, or worse. The hall fell silent as the women contemplated this choice. They had all sacrificed much to build their hidden influence, but now they faced the possibility of sacrificing everything for the chance to transform their society permanently. Yuki found herself thinking of Kenji, the samurai who had refused seppuku and chosen disgrace over death. His choice had seemed individual, personal, a matter of conscience rather than strategy. But now she understood that his rebellion and theirs were part of the same larger transformation. The emergence of people willing to reject the roles assigned to them by an unjust system, even when that rejection carried terrible costs. I have something to report, Yuki said, rising to address the assembly. In our domain, there is already such a person, a former samurai who chose disgrace over death, who now teaches forbidden knowledge to the lowest castes. He has created a network of education and resistance that operates parallel to our own. She described Kenji's work with the ETA and Heinen, his teaching of literacy and critical thinking, the way his students had begun to question not just their individual circumstances, but the entire system that oppressed them. This suggests, she continued, that transformation is already beginning at multiple levels of society. We are not alone in imagining alternatives to the current order. Lady Moon leaned forward, her eyes bright with interest. Tell me more about this former samurai. What kind of man chooses teaching over suicide? Yuki thought carefully about how to describe Kenji without revealing details that could endanger him or his students. A man who discovered that true honor lies not in preserving an unjust system, but in serving human dignity wherever it can be found. A man who learned that questions are more important than answers, that teaching is more valuable than ruling. Such a man could be valuable to our work, Lady Moon observed, but he could also be dangerous to us. Men who reject their assigned roles often become unpredictable, unreliable. They may serve justice, but they may not serve strategy. The comment revealed one of the fundamental tensions within any resistance movement: the balance between moral principle and practical effectiveness. Kenji's refusal to commit seppuku was morally admirable, but it had also made him an outcast whose activities could bring unwanted attention to anyone associated with him. "I believe," Yuki said carefully, "that his commitment to justice makes him more reliable, not less. He has already paid the ultimate price for his principles. He has nothing left to lose and everything to gain from the success of our shared vision." Lady Moon nodded slowly. "Then perhaps it is time to test whether these parallel networks can work together. I propose that you serve as our liaison to this former samurai and his students. Learn whether they can be trusted with larger purposes. Discover whether their resistance can serve our strategy." The assignment was both an honor and a tremendous responsibility. Yuki would be the bridge between two very different forms of resistance: the women's network that operated through influence and manipulation, and Kenji's educational movement that sought to transform consciousness from the ground up. But it was also a test of her own commitment and capabilities. If she could successfully coordinate between these networks, she would prove herself worthy of greater responsibilities within Lady Moon's organization. If she failed, she might endanger both groups and lose her place in either one. The meeting continued through the night, as the women planned coordinated actions that would test their ability to influence events while remaining hidden. They would gather intelligence about military preparations in various domains, economic conditions that might affect political stability, and social developments that might indicate broader patterns of resistance. Most importantly, they would begin identifying potential allies among men who held official power but might be sympathetic to more just arrangements. This was perhaps the most dangerous aspect of their work. Approaching powerful men with ideas that challenged the foundations of their authority required extraordinary skill and careful preparation. As dawn approached, and the women prepared to return to their various disguises and destinations, Yuki felt that she was part of something larger than individual ambition or even collective resistance. She was part of a historical transformation that would ultimately touch every aspect of Japanese society. But she also understood the price that such transformation demanded. Change was not a gentle process of gradual improvement, but a violent rupture that destroyed as much as it created. The old certainties would have to die before new possibilities could be born. The journey back to her domain gave Yuki time to reflect on what she had learned and what she had committed herself to. The mountain paths that had seemed foreign on her journey to the temple now felt familiar, as if she had gained not just new knowledge, but a new way of seeing the world around her. When she finally returned to her small room behind the kitchen, resuming her duties as a servant, while secretly preparing for her new responsibilities as a liaison between resistance networks, Yuki carried with her a vision of the future that would have been unimaginable just days before. But she also carried an awareness of the immediate dangers that her new role would entail. Connecting Kenji's educational network with Lady Moon's intelligence operation would require her to move more openly between social classes, to carry messages and coordinate activities in ways that might attract official attention. Her next meeting with Kenji would need to be carefully planned and perfectly executed. She would have to reveal enough about the women's network to demonstrate its value without exposing it to unnecessary risks. She would have to assess his willingness to expand his activities beyond education to include more direct political action. Most importantly, she would have to determine whether the two forms of resistance could truly work together, or whether their different approaches and goals would make cooperation impossible. As spring moved toward summer, the pace of political change accelerated throughout Japan. The Tokugawa shogunate was moving more aggressively to consolidate power, demanding greater submission from the various domains and punishing resistance with increasing severity. At the same time, reports of unusual activities among the lower classes were spreading from domain to domain. Educated servants, literate farmers, politically aware craftsmen, the phenomena that had worried local authorities were becoming regional concerns. Yuki's own domain was no exception. The questioning of Jiro, Hiroshi's son, had been followed by similar incidents involving other members of Kenji's informal network. While no one had been seriously punished yet, the pattern of official attention was clearly escalating. Commander Hayashi had begun conducting regular inspections of village schools, questioning teachers about their curricula, and examining students for evidence of inappropriate education. He had also increased patrols along the roads that connected the domain to its neighbors, looking for signs of unauthorized communication between communities. Most ominously, He had begun offering rewards for information about unusual gatherings, secret meetings, or individuals who seemed to possess knowledge beyond their station. The offer was carefully worded to avoid suggesting that serious crimes were suspected, but everyone understood that the authorities were looking for evidence of organized resistance. Yuki realized that the window for secret activity was closing rapidly. If the parallel networks were going to coordinate their efforts, it would have to happen soon, before increased surveillance made such coordination impossible. She arranged to meet Kenji at the abandoned shrine where she had first encountered his school, using a message system that they had developed for emergency communications. The message, hidden in a pattern of stones along a mountain path, indicated that she had urgent information that could affect the safety of his students. When they met 3 nights later, under a new moon that provided maximum darkness for their clandestine gathering, Yuki found Kenji looking older and more careworn than she remembered. The constant stress of maintaining his educational activities while avoiding detection was clearly taking its toll. "The pressure is increasing," he confirmed when she asked about recent developments. "Several of my students have been questioned, though carefully, as if the authorities suspect something but don't yet know what. And there are rumors of similar investigations in neighboring domains." Yuki nodded. "I have information that may explain these patterns, and I have a proposal that might help us respond to them more effectively." She proceeded to outline, in carefully chosen terms, the existence of the Women's Intelligence Network. She described their analysis of the political situation, their assessment of the growing pressure on various forms of resistance, and their proposal for coordination between different opposition groups. Kenji listened with the same intense attention that he brought to all forms of learning. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications of what she had told him. "You're describing something that I had not imagined possible," he said finally. "An organized resistance that operates at the highest levels of society, that has already achieved influence within the very system it seeks to change." "The question," Yuki replied, "is whether your network and ours can work together effectively. We need the grassroots education and consciousness raising that you provide. You need the political intelligence and high-level connections that we can offer." Kenji understood the logic, but he also understood the risks. "My students are already in danger simply from learning to read and think. If they become involved in political activities that the authorities consider treasonous—" "They are already involved in such activities," Yuki pointed out. "Education itself is political when it is provided to people who are supposed to remain ignorant. The question is whether we can make their resistance more effective and better protected." The conversation continued for hours as they explored the practical and philosophical challenges of merging 2 very different approaches to social change. Kenji's work was based on the belief that lasting transformation required changes in consciousness, that people needed to understand the injustices of their situation before they could effectively resist them. The Women's Network, by contrast, focused on influencing existing power structures, working within the system to create space for change rather than trying to replace the system entirely. Both approaches had strengths and weaknesses. Education was slow, but created lasting change in how people thought about themselves and their world. Political manipulation was faster, but depended on the continued cooperation of people whose fundamental interests were opposed to justice. "Perhaps," Kenji suggested, "the question is not whether one approach is better than the other, but whether they can be combined in ways that maximize the strengths of both while minimizing their weaknesses." This insight would prove to be the foundation of the strategy they developed over the following weeks. Instead of trying to merge their networks completely, they would coordinate specific activities where their different capabilities could complement each other. The Women's Network would provide early warning about official investigations, policy changes, and political developments that might affect the safety of Kenji's students. In return, Kenji's educational activities would help create the informed population that the Women's Network needed to make their political strategies effective. More ambitiously, they would work together to identify and protect potential allies within the official power structure: samurai, administrators, and even daimyo, who might be sympathetic to more just arrangements, but who needed encouragement and support to act on their better instincts. This work would require them to develop new forms of communication that could operate across social classes without attracting attention. They would need to create safe ways for educated servants to share information with enlightened farmers, for politically aware craftsmen to coordinate with sympathetic merchants, for women with high-level connections to guide the actions of men with grassroots influence. The system they developed was elegant in its simplicity and subversive in its implications. They would use the existing cultural practices of feudal Japan, religious festivals, seasonal ceremonies, traditional craft exchanges, as cover for political communications. A particular arrangement of flowers left at a shrine might indicate that a political meeting was planned. A specific pattern in a textile design could carry information about troop movements or policy changes. Songs performed at festivals could include coded messages about resistance activities. Most cleverly, they would use the tea ceremony itself as a medium for political coordination. The formal structure of the ceremony provided perfect cover for meetings between people from different social classes, while its emphasis on subtle communication through gesture and symbol made it ideal for conveying sensitive information. Yuki, with her mastery of tea ceremony and her established connections to samurai households, would serve as the primary coordinator of this communication system. She would host ceremonies that appeared to be cultural events, but actually served as intelligence briefings and strategy sessions. Kenji would ensure that his students understood the coded meanings embedded in these cultural practices, so that they could participate in the communication network without seeming to step outside their assigned social roles. The first test of their coordinated system came sooner than expected, when Yuki's sources within the women's network warned that Commander Hayashi was planning a major crackdown on unauthorized educational activities. The operation was scheduled to begin with simultaneous raids on suspected meeting places throughout the domain, followed by mass arrests of anyone found to possess prohibited knowledge. The warning gave them less than a week to prepare. In that time, they had to alert all of Kenji's students, remove or hide any evidence of educational activities, and create alternative explanations for any suspicious associations that the authorities might discover. But they also saw an opportunity in the planned crackdown. If they could demonstrate that the resistance was more widespread and better organized than the authorities suspected, they might be able to discourage future persecution by making it clear that suppression would be more difficult and costly than accommodation. The plan they developed was audacious and dangerous. Instead of simply hiding from the raids, they would turn them into public demonstrations of the justice of their cause and the brutality of official response. On the night before the planned raids, coordinated groups throughout the domain would engage in acts of visible but non-violent resistance. They would post anonymous writings that questioned the moral basis of the feudal system. They would leave symbolic objects that suggested widespread opposition to current arrangements. Most dramatically, they would ensure that the raids themselves would encounter not frightened individuals hiding illegal books, but organized groups engaged in obviously beneficial community activities. When the authorities arrived at the abandoned shrine where Kenji had conducted his classes, they would find not evidence of seditious education, but a community gathering focused on disaster preparedness, teaching people how to respond to earthquakes, floods, and fires that periodically devastated rural communities. When they investigated reports of unauthorized literacy among farmers, they would discover people studying agricultural techniques that could improve crop yields and reduce famine risk. When they examined suspicious meetings among craftsmen, they would find groups working to develop new manufacturing methods that could strengthen the domain's economy. All of these activities were technically legal and obviously beneficial to the community, but they also required exactly the kind of education, critical thinking, and organizational capability that the authorities were trying to suppress. The message would be clear. The knowledge and skills that the feudal system tried to restrict were not threats to order, but necessities for prosperity. Suppressing them would mean sacrificing the domain's welfare to preserve the privileges of an increasingly irrelevant aristocracy. The night of the raids was one of the longest of Yuki's life. She had positioned herself to observe the authorities' response while remaining available to coordinate emergency communications if the plan went wrong. She watched from the shadows as Commander Hayashi led his forces to the shrine where Kenji's group had gathered. She held her breath as the soldiers surrounded the building, expecting to find evidence of treasonous education. Instead, they found 30 villagers engaged in a practical discussion of flood control measures, led by an elderly farmer who had survived 3 major disasters and wanted to share his knowledge with younger community members. The discussion was being recorded by several literate participants, including some of Kenji's former students, but the content was entirely focused on community safety rather than political resistance. Commander Hayashi's frustration was visible even from Yuki's distant vantage point. He had expected to find clear evidence of seditious activity that would justify severe punishments. Instead, he found himself in the position of having to arrest people for learning how to protect their communities from natural disasters. The scene at other raid locations was similar. Everywhere the authorities looked for evidence of dangerous resistance, they found beneficial community activities that happened to require the kind of education and organization that the feudal system discouraged. But the most powerful moment came when Commander Hayashi himself was confronted by old grandmother Toshi, the ETA woman who had become one of Kenji's most devoted students. "Honored sir," she said, bowing deeply but speaking with clear dignity, "I am grateful for this opportunity to demonstrate our loyalty to the domain. The knowledge we have gained about disaster preparation will help us better serve our Lord when the next emergency arises." The words were perfectly respectful, but they carried an unmistakable challenge. If learning was treason, then the domain would have to choose between loyalty and ignorance, between prosperity and hierarchy. Commander Hayashi found himself facing a choice that he had not anticipated. He could proceed with arrests that would make him appear to be punishing people for trying to help their community, or he could retreat without the evidence of seditious activity that had justified the raids in the first place. He chose retreat, but he also chose to escalate the conflict in a different direction. If he could not prove that education was treason, he would prove that it was unnecessary by demonstrating the consequences of challenging official authority. The retaliation came not through mass arrests, but through administrative harassment designed to make life so difficult for suspected resistors that they would abandon their activities voluntarily. Families associated with Kenji's educational network found their tax assessments increased without explanation. Merchants who had supported educational activities discovered that their licenses to trade were being reviewed for compliance with obscure regulations. Craftsmen who had participated in community learning groups were excluded from lucrative contracts with the domain administration. The message was clear. Resistance would be punished, not through dramatic executions that might create martyrs, but through quiet economic pressure that would strangle opposition without attracting attention to its existence. But this strategy of quiet suppression also created opportunities for the coordinated resistance network that Yuki and Kenji had developed. The administrative harassment required individual decisions by dozens of officials, many of whom were uncomfortable with punishing people for trying to improve their communities. Through her connections within the Women's Intelligence Network, Yuki was able to identify officials who could be influenced to resist or moderate the pressure campaign. Some were convinced through appeals to their sense of justice. Others were influenced through the promise of economic benefits if they supported community development rather than hindering it. Most importantly, the coordination between Kenji's educational network and the women's political operation allowed them to document the systematic nature of the harassment campaign. They could prove that the domain's administration was deliberately punishing beneficial community activities in order to preserve an increasingly dysfunctional social hierarchy. This documentation would prove crucial when the political crisis that everyone had been anticipating finally arrived in the form of demands from the Tokugawa shogunate for increased tribute and tighter control over domain affairs. Lord Matsuda found himself facing pressure from above to extract more resources from his domain, while dealing with growing evidence that his methods of social control were undermining rather than strengthening his ability to meet those demands. The dilemma was stark. He could maintain the traditional system and watch his domain become increasingly impoverished and unstable, or he could experiment with more flexible arrangements that might preserve prosperity but challenge the hierarchical principles on which his authority was based. It was at this moment of crisis that the Coordinated Resistance Network revealed its true purpose and its ultimate vision for Japanese society. Through channels that reached from the Women's Intelligence Network to sympathetic officials within Lord Matsuda's administration, a proposal began to circulate that offered a way out of the impossible dilemma facing the domain. Instead of trying to extract more resources through traditional methods that were clearly failing, the domain could experiment with arrangements that rewarded productivity, encouraged innovation, and utilized the talents of all its people, regardless of their birth status. The proposal was carefully crafted to seem like pragmatic policy rather than revolutionary ideology. It suggested modest reforms that could be presented as temporary measures to address the current crisis, but which would actually create the foundation for a more just and sustainable social order. Farmers would be allowed to keep larger portions of their harvest in exchange for meeting productivity targets. Craftsmen would be encouraged to form associations that could develop new techniques and products. Merchants would be given greater freedom to trade in exchange for contributing larger amounts to domain revenues. Most radically, the proposal suggested that the domain could benefit from utilizing the knowledge and skills of people who were currently excluded from productive activities because of their birth status. The ETA and Hainan possessed practical knowledge about waste management, leatherworking, and other essential but despised activities. If their contributions were recognized and rewarded rather than stigmatized, the domain's overall efficiency and prosperity could increase significantly. Women at all social levels possessed information about household management, local economic conditions, and community needs that could inform better policy decisions. If their insights were systematically gathered and analyzed, administrators could make more effective choices about resource allocation and community development. Even farmers and craftsmen often understood technical and practical aspects of their work better than the samurai administrators who supposedly supervised them. If their expertise were incorporated into decision-making processes, the domain could avoid costly mistakes and identify beneficial innovations. The proposal was revolutionary in its implications, but it was presented in language that emphasized practical benefits rather than moral principles. It appealed to Lord Matsuda's need to strengthen his domain's position rather than to abstract ideals of justice or equality. Most cleverly, it was designed to be implemented gradually through existing administrative structures, rather than requiring dramatic changes that would alarm conservative elements within the domain or attract unwanted attention from the Tokugawa authorities. As summer moved toward autumn, the proposal began to work its way through the complex bureaucracy of domain administration. Some officials embraced it as a practical solution to urgent problems. Others resisted it as a dangerous departure from traditional ways. But the coordinated resistance network that had created the proposal was also working to ensure its acceptance. Through their various forms of influence, education, intelligence, economic pressure, and political manipulation, they guided the domain toward choices that would serve justice while appearing to serve only practical necessity. The transformation was slow and often invisible, but it was real. People who had been officially powerless were finding ways to contribute to decisions that affected their lives. Knowledge that had been restricted to the upper classes was spreading throughout the community. Economic relationships that had been based purely on hierarchy were being supplemented by arrangements that rewarded merit and productivity. The feudal system was not being overthrown, but it was being hollowed out from within, its rigid structures maintained as facades while more flexible and just relationships developed beneath the surface. But this quiet revolution was also creating new vulnerabilities and new dangers. As the domain became more prosperous and stable through its reforms, it also became more visible to the Tokugawa authorities who were suspicious of any innovation that might challenge their system of control. Reports about unusual developments in Lord Matsuda's domain were beginning to reach the shogunal capital. Observers noted the improved economic conditions, the reduced social tension, the unusual cooperation between different social classes. Some viewed these developments positively, as examples of effective administration that other domains might emulate. But others saw them as dangerous precedents that could undermine the rigid hierarchy on which Tokugawa power depended. The coordinated resistance network that had achieved such remarkable success in transforming their local community now faced the ultimate test: whether their innovations could survive contact with the larger forces that were reshaping Japan. The answer would determine not just the fate of their domain, but the possibility of extending their vision of justice to the entire country. As winter approached once again, bringing with it the quiet beauty of snow-covered landscapes and the deeper quiet of a community that had learned to work together despite the artificial barriers that had once divided it, Yuki and Kenji prepared for the challenges that the coming year would bring. They had proven that resistance was possible, that transformation could occur even within systems designed to prevent it, that ordinary people possessed the intelligence and courage to create extraordinary change. But they had also learned that every victory created new responsibilities, that every step toward justice required greater risks, that the price of freedom was not just eternal vigilance, but eternal struggle. The snow fell softly on their transformed domain, covering old injustices and new possibilities with the same gentle white blanket. In that equalizing embrace of winter, all things seemed possible. All dreams of justice seemed within reach. But spring would come again, bringing with it new growth and new challenges, new opportunities for progress and new threats to everything they had built. For now, though, there was only the peaceful silence of snow-covered fields, the warm glow of lanterns in windows where people gathered to share knowledge and plan for tomorrow, and the quiet satisfaction of work well done in service of a better world. Rest now in that peace, knowing that the struggles of Yuki and Kenji continue in every generation, in every place where human dignity confronts systems that deny it. Their example reminds us that transformation is always possible, that justice can grow even in the most unlikely soil, that the arc of history bends toward righteousness when ordinary people choose to bend it. Sleep and dream of the spring that always follows winter, of the light that always returns after darkness, of the hope that sustains all those who work for a more just and compassionate world. The temple bells are silent now, but their echo carries the promise that every ending is also a beginning, every winter the preparation for spring, every struggle for justice a step toward the world that ought to be. In that promise, find peace. In that hope, find rest. In that vision of transformation, find the dreams that prepare the soul for tomorrow's opportunities to serve the cause of human flourishing. The cherry blossoms were falling early that year, their pale petals drifting through the air like snow in spring. But this was not the gentle farewell of seasons changing. This was the hurried departure of beauty fleeing from approaching storm clouds. Winter had ended, but spring brought no relief from the tensions building throughout the domain. Word had reached the Tokugawa capital about unusual developments in Lord Matsuda's territory: improved prosperity, reduced social conflict, disturbing reports of cooperation between social classes that should have remained rigidly separate. A special inspector had been dispatched from Edo, a man whose reputation for enforcing orthodox Confucian principles was matched only by his skill at detecting and crushing innovation. Inspector Yamamoto was not coming to assess the domain's success, but to investigate its suspected failures of proper hierarchy. Yuki learned of his approach through the Women's Intelligence Network. The message was brief but chilling. The inspector comes not to praise but to purify. He seeks examples to discourage others. Prepare for the fire. Walking through the castle town in the early morning mist, Yuki could see evidence of transformation that had made their domain prosperous, but also dangerous. Farmers moved with confidence rather than beaten-down submission. Craftsmen's workshops hummed with innovative activity. Even the ETA quarter now showed signs of organization and hope. All these changes had improved life and increased prosperity, but they had also created exactly the evidence that Inspector Yamamoto would use to justify harsh punishment for dangerous deviation from proper order. The inspector arrived when cherry blossoms were falling most heavily, their pink petals carpeting the roads like snow mixed with blood. His procession was deliberately modest: a few officials, a small guard, no ceremony that might suggest anything more than routine oversight. But Yuki, watching from her position as servant in Lord Matsuda's household, could read the subtle signs revealing the true nature of his mission. This was not an inspection. It was an investigation designed to gather evidence for predetermined conclusions. Lord Matsuda received Inspector Yamamoto with formal courtesy, but Yuki could see the tension in his movements, the careful calculation behind every word. He understood that his domain's innovations, however beneficial, had marked him as potentially disloyal to rigid orthodoxy. The first day proceeded according to ritual. Inspector Yamamoto reviewed records, examined procedures, assessed military readiness. Everything appeared in proper order, perhaps even exemplary. But on the second day, the inspector began asking different questions. Why did agricultural output exceed projections? How had social conflicts been reduced so dramatically? What accounted for unusual cooperation between different classes? These questions had no safe answers. Truth would reveal the coordinated resistance network that had transformed the domain. But lies would eventually be detected by an investigator as skilled as Yamamoto. Lord Matsuda chose a middle path, describing improvements in terms of traditional virtues rather than innovative methods. Increased output resulted from renewed Confucian harmony. Reduced conflicts came from better moral instruction. Cooperation reflected natural order working properly under wise administration. Inspector Yamamoto listened with polite attention, but his questions grew increasingly pointed. He wanted to examine schools, interview farmers, visit workshops. Each request was reasonable and impossible to refuse, but each would provide opportunities to discover the educational and organizational activities that had actually created the improvements. That night, an emergency meeting convened in the mountain shrine where Kenji's network had first taken shape. But this was no longer a gathering of desperate outcasts. Representatives came from throughout the domain. Farmers who had learned to read and think, craftsmen who had organized to improve techniques, merchants who had developed new cooperation. They included unexpected allies, samurai like Tanaka-san, who had quietly supported reforms, administrators who had discovered that just governance was more effective than oppressive governance, officials who believed the domain's innovations should be protected rather than punished. At the center sat Kenji and Yuki, no longer isolated individuals, but coordinators of transformation touching every aspect of their community's life. Inspector Yamamoto will find what he seeks, Kenji said quietly. Evidence of education among those who should be ignorant, organization among those who should be isolated, hope among those who should be resigned. Yuki nodded. The question is not whether he will discover our activities, but how we respond when he does. We can scatter and preserve what we've built in secret, or stand together and defend what we believe openly. The choice was stark. Continued secrecy might allow individuals to survive, but would mean abandoning community transformation. Open resistance would certainly mean punishment, but might create a precedent inspiring similar movements throughout Japan. Miki spoke first, the brilliant young ETA woman whose questions had helped Kenji understand their work's deeper implications. She rose from among people who a year earlier would never have acknowledged her existence, addressing the assembly with quiet dignity. I have spent my life being told that my birth makes me worthless, that my existence pollutes others, that I should accept degradation as natural order, she said. But this community taught me that worth comes from character, not birth. That dignity belongs to all human beings, not just those born into privilege. She paused, looking around at faces reflecting every level of social hierarchy, united by shared commitment to justice rather than divided by artificial distinctions. If we hide now, we tell the world our vision was wrong, that transformation is impossible, that injustice really is natural order. But if we stand together, we prove that human beings can choose cooperation over competition, justice over privilege, hope over despair. Her words struck the assembly like lightning illuminating dark landscape. Everyone understood they faced a choice not just about survival, but about the fundamental nature of human society. Old grandmother Toshi stood slowly. I have lived through many changes, seen many promises broken, watched many hopes die, but I have learned that transformation is possible when people choose it together. She looked toward Inspector Yamamoto's quarters, visible through the trees. Let him see what we have built. Let him report that there are people in Japan who refuse to accept that birth determines worth, who insist that all human beings deserve dignity and opportunity. One by one, others rose to speak. Each voice added to a growing chorus of commitment that echoed through the mountain shrine and seemed to reach toward the stars themselves. When the last person had spoken, Kenji and Yuki looked at each other with understanding, requiring no words. They had started their resistance as individuals driven by personal conscience. They would finish it as leaders of a community committed to transformation that could outlast any individual persecution. The next morning, Inspector Yamamoto began his detailed examination with a visit to the village school where much of Kenji's educational work had been conducted. He found not hidden evidence of seditious teaching, but an open classroom where children from different social classes sat together, learning not just traditional moral instruction, but practical skills that could improve their community's prosperity. The teacher, a former student of Kenji's carefully prepared for this moment, explained the curriculum emphasizing service rather than personal advancement. We teach children to read so they can better understand duties to their Lord. We teach mathematics so they can contribute more effectively to prosperity. We teach them to think so they can serve more wisely. Inspector Yamamoto questioned the children directly, testing their knowledge and understanding of social relationships. What he found disturbed him profoundly. Children who understood their assigned roles but also understood human dignity, transcending those roles. Children who respected authority but also questioned injustice. Children who had learned critical thinking while maintaining genuine community loyalty. This was not the ignorant submission the feudal system was designed to produce, but also not the dangerous rebellion that orthodoxy taught was the only alternative. It was something new. Educated cooperation based on shared commitment to justice rather than blind obedience to arbitrary hierarchy. His investigation of craft workshops revealed similar patterns. Artisans who preserved traditional techniques while developing innovations improving quality and efficiency. Workers who respected masters while taking initiative to solve problems. Economic relationships serving hierarchy while creating prosperity benefiting entire communities. Most unsettling was his visit to the ETA quarter, where he expected degraded resignation that official ideology insisted was natural. Instead, he found organized communities engaged in essential work they approached with pride and skill. People who accepted their social position while refusing to accept that position made them worthless. By his third day, Inspector Yamamoto had accumulated evidence that innovations were far more extensive than initial reports suggested. But he had also discovered these innovations could not be easily categorized as either loyal service or dangerous rebellion. The people he interviewed expressed genuine respect for proper order and legitimate authority, but they also demonstrated forms of thinking and organization, challenging the assumptions on which feudal hierarchy was based. That evening, Inspector Yamamoto requested a private meeting with Lord Matsuda to discuss his findings. "Your domain shows remarkable prosperity and stability," Inspector Yamamoto began carefully. "The people appear loyal, and administration appears effective." Lord Matsuda, coached by Yuki and other resistance members, replied with equal care. "We have sought to apply traditional principles in ways that serve both the shogun's interests and the people's welfare." "Indeed," Inspector Yamamoto continued, "but I have observed innovations that seem to depart from established practices. Educational opportunities for people beyond their station, economic arrangements that blur class distinctions, cooperation between social levels that should remain separate." The moment had arrived when everything would be decided. Lord Matsuda could attempt to minimize the innovations, risking discovery of systematic resistance. Or he could defend them as beneficial developments serving larger purposes. He chose a third path, developed through careful consultation with the resistance network's most skilled strategists. "Honored Inspector," he said with deep respect, "I would welcome your guidance in understanding whether our efforts to strengthen the domain have inadvertently violated proper principles. Perhaps you would allow me to demonstrate how our innovations serve traditional goals rather than challenging them." The request was both humble and clever. By asking for instruction rather than defending his position, Lord Matsuda avoided appearing to challenge authority. But by offering to demonstrate rather than merely explain, he created opportunity to show how transformation actually worked. Over following days, Inspector Yamamoto was given unprecedented access to every aspect of operations. He observed schools where education strengthened rather than weakened social bonds. He visited workshops where innovation increased rather than decreased respect for traditional craftsmanship. He met farmers whose improved understanding allowed them to serve their lord more effectively. Most importantly, he was introduced to the philosophical framework the resistance network had developed to justify innovations in terms orthodox Confucian thought could accept. The key insight was that true hierarchy served human flourishing rather than merely preserving privilege. When social arrangements actually helped people develop capabilities and contribute to community welfare, they strengthened rather than weakened legitimate authority. But when hierarchy became an end in itself, when it prevented people from serving effectively or forced them to waste talents, it violated the very principles it claimed to uphold. By this standard, the domain's innovations were not departures from proper order, but returns to its true meaning. Education that helped people serve more effectively was more orthodox than ignorance making service impossible. Inspector Yamamoto found himself confronting ideas that challenged his assumptions while appealing to his deepest convictions about governance and moral order. The innovations were clearly departures from standard practice, but seemed to achieve the goals that standard practice claimed to serve better than standard practice itself. After a week of investigation, Inspector Yamamoto made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. Instead of condemning the innovations, he requested detailed documentation of their methods and results. "It appears," he wrote in his report to the capital, "that this domain has developed approaches to governance that deserve careful study. While some methods depart from established practice, their results suggest these departures may serve traditional goals more effectively than traditional methods." He recommended that other domains be encouraged to study Lord Matsuda's innovations and consider whether similar approaches might strengthen rather than weaken the shogunal system. The recommendation was revolutionary in implications, though conservative in language. If accepted, it would legitimate exactly the transformation the coordinated resistance network had been working to achieve. The months that followed brought visits from officials representing different factions within the administration. Some came seeking to understand innovations that might strengthen their own domains. Others came hoping to gather evidence justifying suppression of dangerous departures from orthodoxy. Each visit was a test of the community's commitment to their shared vision and their ability to present that vision in terms serving larger purposes rather than threatening established order. The resistance network that had begun with a disgraced samurai teaching forbidden knowledge to untouchables had evolved into a sophisticated political movement capable of influencing policy at government's highest levels. As autumn arrived again, bringing the familiar cycle of harvest and preparation for winter, Yuki and Kenji found themselves reflecting on how much had changed since their first meeting in the mountain shrine. Their domain had become a model being studied throughout Japan. Educational innovations that started with secret lessons for outcasts were now being adapted by official schools. Economic arrangements that emerged from desperate survival attempts were being adopted by domains seeking improved prosperity. Most importantly, the vision of human dignity that had driven their resistance was beginning to influence discussions about governance and social organization at Japanese society's highest levels. But transformation is never complete, and justice is never permanently secured. Each generation must choose whether to preserve past gains or extend them toward greater possibilities. As snow began to fall again, covering their transformed domain in white silence that makes all things appear possible, Yuki and Kenji understood their work was both finished and just beginning. They had proven that ordinary people could create extraordinary change, that rigid systems could be transformed through patient work and coordinated resistance, that human dignity could triumph over artificial hierarchy when people chose to make it. But they had also learned that such victories required constant vigilance, continuous effort, and the willingness of each new generation to choose transformation over stagnation, justice over privilege, hope over despair. The cherry blossoms would bloom again in spring, carrying their eternal message about the beauty and fragility of all things. But now they would bloom in a world where that fragility had become strength, where acceptance of change had made transformation possible, where recognition of mortality had inspired greater appreciation for life. Their stories remind us that history is not a force of nature, but a human creation, shaped by choices of individuals who decide whether to accept injustice as inevitable or work to make justice possible. You would not have lasted a day in feudal Japan, not because you lack courage or intelligence, but because you possess something that system was designed to destroy: the unshakable belief that all human beings deserve dignity, opportunity, and hope. Sleep well in that knowledge. Dream of cherry blossoms falling not as symbols of loss, but as promises of renewal. Remember that the future you help create will be shaped by the same choice that faced Kenji and Yuki, whether to accept injustice as inevitable or work for transformation that makes justice possible. The snow falls softly on the domain where education became revolution, where questions became hope, where the impossible became inevitable through patient work of ordinary people choosing extraordinary things. In that peace, find rest. In that hope, find dreams. In that promise of transformation, find sleep that prepares the soul for tomorrow's opportunities to serve human flourishing. Rest now, modern dreamer, knowing their example lives on in every person who chooses justice over safety, truth over comfort, transformation over stagnation. The struggles of the past created the freedoms of the present, and your choices will shape the possibilities of the future. The cherry blossoms will bloom again, as they always have, but the world they bloom in will be what we make it, through the same patient courage that transformed feudal Japan from rigid hierarchy into a stepping stone toward human dignity. Sleep and dream of spring.